A couple of days ago, Wizards released an update to the bracket system. Let's talk about it. I've been using the brackets a lot, not just for my own games, but also as the basis of my matchmaking system for the Friday night event I run at my local game store. And I think it's been a great tool to help alleviate game experience expectation mismatches. But of course, I have encountered some issues. It's still on the beta. The most common of which, I think, is quite unexpected. Players often overestimated the bracket of their deck. Based on all of the common online discussions I've seen, I would have expected the exact opposite. Players disguising or rules lawyering their deck to pub stomp. But I gotta be honest, the Magic community that I often see described on Reddit is not the Magic community that I've had the pleasure to experience. Rather, I constantly had people overestimating their own decks to make absolutely sure they are not accidentally pub stomping. This went so far that at the Command Fest in Bonn, I've had somebody play an unmodified Precon in bracket 3 with the argument that it was a strong Precon, so it's not bracket 2. At this event, I had a very difficult time finding any bracket 2 games. It seemed like people were actively avoiding that classification. Bracket 2 was seen as a lesser bracket, a space for incompetent decks. This was caused primarily because Bracket 2 included Precons, and many players share the perception that Precons are, well, terrible. I think there are two root causes here. First, for a long time, they were. Old Precons sucked ass. But that's not true anymore. I would argue that most of the recent Precon releases have been perfectly playable decks that follow all the basic principles of Commander: ramp, card draw, and escalation, all while sticking somewhat close to their game plan. There are fairly big differences once we start looking at specific Precons, but overall, most are fine out of the box and can be made proper Commander decks with only a few minor adjustments. But they are then held back by reason 2. Precons are most commonly played by new players, and new players are bad. I've recently had the rare pleasure to witness experienced, good Commander players pilot the recent Precon releases, and the results are night and day. It's drastically changed how I perceive these decks. But I'm me, I like spending time thinking about these things. Most just see new players struggling to participate in a game and conclude that their deck must not be good. This is not meant to be a judgment, it's just what I've observed. The old Bracket 2 definition explicitly included Precons. This put a necessary ceiling on the bracket that, on a conceptual level, is quite well defined. The ceiling has to be a level where Precon can still play, and at least stand a chance at winning. But as we clash back into reality, we head to Caveat City and we have to ask ourselves what that actually means. I already touched on this earlier, but there's a range of power levels if it comes to Precons. The World Shaper deck is much more powerful than most of the other Precons I can think of. Maybe the Jump Scare Precon gets close, but that's about it. It's super strong. It would be fairly easy to put together a pod playing only recent Precons that feels as if there should be a bracket difference between the various decks. Interestingly, this is something that Gavin has brought up multiple times, where he would like to release Precons with a bracket descriptor on the box, but that's not the world we live in right now. Right now, there's just some huge gaps between how strong these Precons are. There's also another question we have to ask here. What even is a Precon? Of course, if we just open up the box and play the cards, then we have a Precon. But does a Precon have to stay unmodified to still be one? And what even counts as modification? If I take the World Shaper Precon and swap Half-Hole for Sorrel, then I think most would agree it's still an unmodified list. But what if I change the commander to Corvold? Corvold is in the deck and he fits the colors to be a commander, but I personally feel that using him as such is a drastic pivot from how the deck was originally intended, which makes it modified even though we didn't change any of the cards in the list. Corvold also asks how we should consider reprints and cards included for exchange within Precons. Precons aren't meant to be finished decks. They are starter decks that include cards intended to be swapped out for more appropriate choices as the players acquire them. Deck building and card collecting are an essential part of the Magic experience, and Precons introduce players to those aspects as well. Treating precons through a purist lens where they are only precons for as long as they stay unmodified misses the point of the product. The problem here is that this clashes against the language of bracket 3, which is called upgraded, and hence implies that the precons in bracket 2 should remain unmodified. I've complained about this specific use of language before, and I will do so again right now. Both upgraded and optimized are terribly chosen words. Upgraded usually implies upgraded precon. Setting this implication as the basis of bracket 3 greatly narrowed down the range of bracket 2. And optimized is a bad choice because it implies that decks in the lower brackets aren't optimized. This creates lots of negative connotations. Commander players put a lot of pride into their decks, and telling them that it's unoptimized unless they're trying to win quickly and efficiently is, frankly, toxic. Commander is exactly the kind of format where decks optimized around terrible ideas are meant to flourish. My mono-white landfall deck is incredibly optimized. It's just that the core idea is so ass that even unmodified precons can't keep up with it. The language of the brackets should support this kind of deck, not disincentivize it like it currently does. Language matters, and the language here is just not good. Unfortunately, this problem persists even after the update. A better way to handle the bracket names would be to center them around the expected play experience rather than a deck descriptor. For example, bracket 2 could be named incremental rather than core. Bracket 2 was also in a unique position compared to the others because it introduced a necessary floor. As much as I sung their praises earlier, there are definitely some stinkers among precons, and since we're talking about a social game, we need to be accommodating to bad players and beginners alike, which set the floor at somebody learning the ropes with a poorly constructed deck that they didn't build themselves. And well, that's quite low. All of these issues pushed players away from bracket 2, but many prefer a lower power commander, meaning they didn't want to be in brackets 4 or 5 either. Bracket 3 had become a melting pot, recreating some of the old chaos. There were also many players, and I consider myself part of this group, that didn't really want to play bracket 3 because they don't like game changers, but whose decks often easily outperformed precons, creating an awkward middle ground that I predicted in my previous bracket video as bracket 2.5. Bracket 2.5 has been a very regular part of the bracket conversations I personally experienced. The common hesitation to embrace bracket 2 also had an unfortunate side effect. Bracket 1 couldn't exist. It was meant to be a space for decks centered around non-gameplay themes, but Magic's card pool is so vast that it's really not that difficult to take any weird idea and make it perfectly playable for bracket 2, especially since the floor created by including precons in bracket 2 was placed so low. Bracket 1 is supposed to be even lower, and that's just not a space players occupy, because it would require actively sabotaging their decks into unplayability. As for brackets 4 and 5, I think they were largely fine. The only issue was cleanly determining the difference between the two, as some treated bracket 4 to be an offshoot of CEDH, which was clearly not the intent. I really like the way a friend of mine once put it, where he said that bracket 4 should be powerful decks, but it shouldn't just be Kinnan with 3 bad cards. Off-meta CEDH is still CEDH, and that's bracket 5. CEDH takes on an odd role within the bracket system because it really shouldn't be part of it. CEDH is a fundamentally different game from Social Commander. I think it'd be great for Wizards to support the CEDH community, but including it in the bracket system feels a bit like creating brackets for Uno and then putting chess at the top. These are just not the same thing, and it's odd that they are being treated as part of the same system. But I also don't want to pretend to be ignorant to the idea that including CEDH is mostly an acknowledgement of the CEDH community, and that has value by itself. So while I think it's odd from a structural perspective, I also don't think it's a big enough problem that it would need to be solved. To summarize, bracket 2's definition was too low and narrow, which gathered players into bracket 3, making that bracket too broad. Bracket 1 then couldn't properly exist because the space below bracket 2 was too small. Bracket 4 and 5 had some minor issues, mostly with distinguishing between them, but they were largely fine. This brings us, finally, to the recent update. The most important part of which is that precons were removed from the bracket 2 definition, alleviating many of the issues that previously existed. There's no longer a necessary floor, which not only raises the overall power level of the bracket, but also gives bracket 1 more room to breathe. The new language of bracket 2 also supports this, as it makes it clear that bracket 2 decks are meant to be fully functional, reasonably powerful decks, and there's just also room to include pet cards or unique synergy pieces that might not be the strongest but are cool. The best and most important addition to this iteration of the brackets are the differentiators at the top, which explain that what sets brackets 2 and 3 apart are staples, which is simple and straightforward to understand. Are you playing cards because they're good by themselves or because they fit into the context of the deck? The first is bracket 3, the second is bracket 2. Another new aspect of the brackets is a listed expectation of how many turns a game in each bracket should last before somebody wins or loses. That's from the bottom up 9, 8, 6, 4 and 0 respectively. CEDH is exempted here because it doesn't apply to them. Looking at this expected turns description tells us something really interesting. The gap between bracket 1 and 2 is negligible. There is no noteworthy difference between winning on turn 10 or 9. It's mostly symbolic, telling us that bracket 1 decks are supposed to be a bit slower than bracket 2 decks, but ultimately it also tells us that bracket 1 decks are still supposed to be playable decks. While this approach to expected turns is a reasonable way to communicate the intended diversity, it unfortunately perpetuates an issue that's been plaguing the bracket system from the outset. Brackets are meant as a guideline communication tool, not as a rule set. Despite that, many view them as exactly that, rules to be followed. This isn't inherently misguided, but an important distinction is that guidelines are something you apply to yourself, while rules are enforced even upon others. The brackets were deliberately vague in their descriptions to give players room for interpretation appropriate to their environment. But with the most recent update, things became more specific, and while that offers clarity to the players that needed it, it also narrows the room for interpretation and turns the guidelines into rules. Whether that's good or bad comes down to who you're asking. Some will want even more specificity, while others will feel restricted. Personally, I worry that turning the brackets into rules might lead to conflict between players, as Commander is a game so dynamic that 4 rules-abiding players can easily create rule-breaking situations, which could not be reasonably enforced by following the letter of the law. The turn restrictions are also problematic for a couple of other reasons. To be expressive, they need to feature a necessary gap. That's why we have the nice 8-6-4 scaling. But that's harsh. Winning on turn 7 is quite fast for casual Commander, even in bracket 3. The Commander Clash crew just released their most recent stats episode, and in their fairly strong pod, with lots of game changers and skillfully built and piloted decks, matches usually only ended after 9.3 turns. People often complain about power creep in Commander, and I usually find that kind of thing silly, because you can just play whatever you want. You don't have to play the strong cards. But giving players this kind of guideline is what will actually cause real, proper power creep, especially since a lot of them will treat it as a rule. Similarly to how many players took the restriction of 3 or less game changers to mean that they should run 3 game changers, many will look at these guidelines and view them as a definition of how strong their deck should be. If you're bracket 3, then you should win by turn 7. The issue here is that we are losing sight of what the brackets were supposed to be. A tool for communicating the intended and desired game experience, not purely a tool to measure power levels. I fully understand the intent of the turn's inclusion, but I think it's largely misguided and is probably gonna lead to more problems than it offers solutions. A question that's been floating around the community is whether or not we need an additional bracket. And before this update, I would have said yes, because bracket 1 wasn't usable. But by allowing bracket 2 to become more powerful, which is something I wasn't expecting, I didn't think they would decouple precons from bracket 2. It has effectively turned into what I would previously have described as bracket 2.5, a space for synergistic decks without relying on good stuff cards. And bracket 1 now hosts decks below that level, but not drastically below it. I think a lot of older Precons are a natural inclusion here, and it's also a good starting ground for new players. We don't need a new bracket because we just got one. Our 3-bracket system was expanded to a 4-bracket system. It's always important to remember that this is still a beta, and just because we conceptually had 5 brackets before didn't mean they were actually usable. The right thing to do now is to reconsider the existing brackets within the new framework and apply them to the fullest extent possible. One last note on brackets. I find it very disappointing that it seems Wizards and the Commander Committee can seemingly only conceptualize theme decks as themes that aren't centered around gameplay. Landfall is still a theme, so are Reanimator, Burn, Creatures with Haste, 2015 Modern Junt, and that weird dream I had that one time. Everything is a theme, and language matters. If you tell players that bracket 1 is where you play theme decks, then that limits how everything else is perceived, and we can do better than that. At the current point though, I'm quite happy with the bracket system. The biggest remaining issue is the names of the individual brackets, but setting that aside, I only have petty complaints that are not worth getting into. I think they did a good job. Nice. Alright, a couple of other points that are part of the current discussion that I want to get into really quick. A few cards were removed from the Game Changer list. I don't think it's worth getting into if those specific cards should be removed or not, because I am happy for any card that is cut. The Game Changer list is already too big. As somebody that runs a fairly popular Commander night at an LGS, I can tell you that many struggle to keep track of which cards are or aren't game changers. So the smaller the list, the better. Genuinely, I have the list available as people sign up for the brackets and they still get it wrong all the time. This is not a problem with the players, it's just difficult to keep track of banned cards and game changers at the same time. Game changers are much more difficult to keep track of than banned cards, because unlike banned cards, you actually encounter them in your games, and that means players become exposed to them and might want to try them themselves without knowing that they are a game changer. The complexity of a second list is also way higher than the complexity of the first. So, I am happy to reduce the number of game changers. They also mentioned that they are debating to make hybrid mana monocolor optional. Basically, hybrid green-red could now be played in mono-green or mono-red. This is a terrible idea. I understand that the original intent of hybrid mana was that it's both monocolors on a single card, but first of all, that doesn't make any sense. Something can't be two monocolors, those are mutually exclusive concepts. And secondly, it would be incredibly confusing to new players. People already struggle with color identity. Game design is often about settling on the option with the least issues. And that's where we already are. This alternate path would create many new problems rather than fixing old ones, and that's just not worth it. But commander damage, oh boy, commander damage. I'm surprised that it was mentioned during the stream at all, but I'm glad. Commander damage is an incredibly poorly first draft design that is in dire need of a rework, so please tackle that one whenever you get the chance to do it. Finally then, the player going last has a terrible win rate, which should be fixed. This was also briefly touched on during the stream. I would like to propose a solution that has become the standard way for me to play the game. I always give the player going last a lucky energy. This is a synergy-less treasure token, basically an emblem they can crack once for mana of any color. To make it clear that it can't be used for any synergies, I use a Pokemon card, because Pokemon cards don't synergize with Magic cards. It's a nice and simple solution that makes going last a little less shit. A couple of months ago, I started handing lucky energies to the last player of whatever table I'm at, and it's always been well received, so I just kept doing it. And over time, it began spreading. Lots of players in my local community play with the lucky energy rule now, and I had a really fun moment a while ago where I started explaining that I'd like to play with the lucky energy rule to someone that I had never played with before, and they cut me off because they already knew what it was and were cool with it. It's a simple solution that alleviates the worst parts of the problem while also being easy to understand and implement. All it requires is a unique token that could easily be printed into Precons or other Commander products, and even if that token isn't available, players can just use literally anything to represent it. Like for example, a lucky energy. Anyways, that's my brackets update recap. Game changer Soul Ring, you cowards. That's it. Video about brackets again. I don't know if anybody cares, but I care. I think this stuff is very, very interesting, so I like talking about it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Don't forget to let me know what you think. I am genuinely very interested. Just yesterday, I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine who took in all of the same information that I took in, right? And his conclusion was actually that he felt that the brackets weren't powered up, but they were powered down. Which I thought was really interesting, because he's a smart guy and he made some compelling arguments for it, although I still disagreed. So I'm sticking to my interpretation. I mean, ultimately, everything is kind of up to how you read the language, right? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Give it a thumbs up, check out my Patreon, link down in the description, and I'll see you guys soon. Goodbye.